Daf Yomi, Tractate Sanhedrin, page 41a, part 2. We're up to the words, it's towards the end, but not sure exactly how many lines, but the words Tashima Echad Omer Sandalav Shechorin. Those are the words that we're starting from. Tashima, the Gemara suggests come in here a proof from a Braita. Echad Omer Sandalav Shechorin, Echad Sandalav Lebenim, Ein Ze Nachon, Hasab Nami, Kigon Shabbat Bo Besandalo V'Harago. If one of the witnesses say the sandals of the murderer were black, and one of the witnesses says the sandals of the murderer were white, this is not congruent testimony. This contradicts the ruling of Rav Chizda. The Gemara answers Rav Chizda can't explain that there also it is speaking of a case where the murderer kicked the victim with his sandal and killed him. Tashima, the Gemara suggests coming here, proof from a Mishnah. Amar Rami Bar Chama, Kigon Sha'agat Te'enam Shabbat, Te'aleh Kamaktil. An incident occurred, and Ben Zakkai examined the witnesses about the stems of figs, indicating that even a contradiction concerning a minor point such as this would render the testimony incongruent. The Gemara answers, Rami Bar Chama said, it is speaking there of a case where he picked a fig on Shabbat, as he is killed for that act itself. Picking a fruit from its source of growth is an example of the forbidden labor of reaping. So, the testimony about the characteristics of the fig is significant. V'otanya, Amar lo, tachat te'ina hargo, ela Amar Rami Bar Chama, kigon sheshipdo b'yichud shel te'ina. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Braita? When Ben Zakkai asked the witnesses the question about the stems of figs, they said to him, the murderer killed the victim beneath a fig tree, indicating that it is speaking of a murder case. Rather, Rami Bar Chama said the Mishnah is speaking of a case where the murderer stabbed the victim with a branch of a fig tree. As Rav Chizda himself ruled, a contradiction concerning details of the murder weapon renders the testimony incongruent. Bichor. It's Kigon Shipido Bichor Shateina. Okay. I think I said Yichud. Okay, so anyway, the race looked like a Dalit. Contradiction. Incongruent. Tashima Amar Lahantena Zu Akitza Takin Akitza Gasin Timesh Choros Tenim Levanos Ela Amar Yosef Ben Zakkai Lo Divinish She'ena Ben Zakkai De Bedikot Kecha Kacha Kirot Meshavele. Come in your proof, as in that same examination, Ben Zakkai says to the witnesses, this fig tree about which you are testifying, were its stems thin or were its stems thick? Were the figs on it black or were the figs white? These questions concern the fruit itself, not the characteristics of a branch. Rather, Rav Yosef says, should a person raise a difficulty from the context of Ben Zakkai is different, as he equated examinations with interrogations. According to Ben Zakkai's opinion, a contradiction in the witnesses answers to an examination is as significant as a contradiction in the witnesses answers to an interrogation, and it also renders the testimony incongruent. My Ben Zakkai, Ilem Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, Mihavi Sanhedrin, Betanya Kol Shenotav, Sheben Yochanan Ben Zakkai, 120 שנה, 40 שנה עסק בפרקמטיה, 40 שנה למד, 40 שנה לימד. The The Gemara clarifies who is the Ben Zakkai mentioned in the Mishnah. If we say that is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, was he a member in a Sanhedrin that judged capital cases? But isn't it taught in Braita? All the years of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai were 120 years. For 40 of those years, he dealt in business, pragmatia. For 40 of those years, he studied. And for 40 of those years, he taught and guided the Jewish people. V'tanya bar Mishana Kodru Churban Habayis, Gos Sanhedrin Yehoshua B'Chanus. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avudimi, Lo mar she'en danu dini knasos al kadaitach, ela shelo danu dini nefashos. The Gemara continues its question, and it's taught in Braita. 40 years before the destruction of the Second Temple, the Sanhedrin was exiled from the chamber of hewn stone, from the Shkara Gazit, and sat in the store near the Temple Mount. Rabbi Yitzchak bar Avudimi says the intent of the statement concerning the relocation of Sanhedrin is to say that they no longer judge the laws of fines. The Gemara asks, does it enter your mind to say that they no longer judge laws of fines? Is it known that the Sanhedrin would judge laws of fines for hundreds of years after the destruction of the temple? Rather, he must have said that the Sanhedrin no longer judge cases of capital law. Once the Sanhedrin left the chamber of hewn stone, the court's power to judge capital cases was nullified. Tana Mishacharav Beis HaMikdash, he's given Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. The Gemara concludes its question, and since we learned in the Mishnah in Sukkah 41a, once the temple was destroyed, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai instituted an ordinance that the mitzvah of lulav should be performed even in the rest of the country for 7 days in commemoration of the temple. It is clear that he was in a position of prominence after the destruction of the temple. Since the Sanhedrin ceased judging cases of capital law 40 years before the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was in a position of prominence for only 40 years. He could not have been a judge in a capital case. Ela ben Zakkai de Alma, Hachi nami mistavra, de Isal kedaitach Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, Kari le Rabbi ben Zakkai. The Gemara suggests, rather, one can say that it was merely a different person named Ben Zakkai, and not the well-known sage of that name. The Gemara comments, so too it is reasonable to say this, as if it enters your mind that it was actually Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Would Rabbi Yehuda call him Ben Zakkai without any title? He must have been referring to someone else. Ve'atanya, my sabadak Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai be'akusitenim ela talmid hayoshiv lifnei rabo have ve'amar milisam stavra lehu tameh. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in Braita explicitly? An incident occurred, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai examined the witnesses with regard to the stems of figs. This proves that the sage in question is Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rather, one can say that at that time, when this incident occurred, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was a student sitting before his teacher. And in those years, the Sanhedrin was in its place and judged cases of capital law. And he said a matter in the course of examining the witnesses, and his reasoning was logical to him. And the judges asked his question.